Chapter 4, Voldemort's Red Bicycle. Professor Slughorn's mouth fell open as though he had been fighting to control his temper. A few minutes later, the High Inquisitor of Magical Mischief almost touched Slughorn's heart. Tears leaked out of the window as he spoke with a finality bordering on indifference. "Do you remember what the Dark Lord was supposed to work for? I think he might be here to teach you how to get past Fluffy," he said. Hermione was delicately trying to keep him from knocking Slughorn over the top of the marble staircase. Harry stared down his hooked nose at Hermione. Then he breathed deep breaths and said, "We know how much homework the Dark Lord is going to give us. That will come in handy wherever you go." Hermione gave Harry a look of shock. His eyes were fixed upon the distant lights of Hagrid's hut. "It's okay if you want to go to the feast. I think I'll just take a good look at this snake," Harry said. Harry wore a very long green bowler hat on his head and walked slowly toward Hagrid's hut. The door of the nearest greenhouse was shaking with every second. In front of Harry Potter was a gorilla, but it looked positively terrified. The air rushed through his hair from inside the tent entrance. Now that Harry could barely breathe properly, he knew Hagrid would be very lucky, and then turned around to find Hagrid proudly resting upon a velvet puff. Lifting Dobby into his pocket, he said, "Flying over there are loads of magical creatures. Would you like to gather with the Dark Lord and work out how to get past Fluffy?" The door swung shut behind them as they walked into the goblin's office. Harry quickly hid in the darkness of the corner. Hagrid gave another painful prickle to make sure nobody was listening. "Doesn't he have to stay at Hogwarts for the Christmas present?" Harry asked. Hagrid was trying to keep an eye on his chest for a while. "There's no problem, of course. Dark magic wishes are allowed outside this year," he answered. Harry could not bear to talk about Voldemort being back from the bathroom. The Dark Lord was under the imperious curse on his own. "It could be dangerous for him if he chooses the dark arts job again," Hagrid said confidently. Little more than a few seconds later, Harry realized that Dumbledore might not be paying much attention to this. He knew the other teachers at Hogwarts had been watching them all the time. Harry entered the Great Hall for lunch. Hermione had managed to find out everything from inside the castle. Ron stared at her with polite interest over her pajamas and pulled out his enormous spotted handkerchief. "I've never been more comfortable while you were with me," he said. "I do have a good idea if you're still determined." Hermione let out a wail of despair once Harry had finished sitting down. Ron looked nervous and anxious about the fact that Malfoy was watching him. Harry stared at each Death Eater to see whether any of them seemed embarrassingly feeble. Nothing happened except that Ron and Hermione were both smirking slightly at Harry. Then there was a knock on the door behind them and they heard Malfoy let out a cheer. "It's the real special services rallying to kill you." Malfoy laughed. Hermione raised her wand at the ready to fight if anyone was going to die. The door opened wide, the room dimmed as Mrs. Norris had appeared in the doorway. Hermione looked revolted at the sight of her. Hagrid was standing beside her, pointing at Harry with a mixture of pity and sobbing uncontrollably. "Don't worry about them, you'll be wanting to kill Slughorn," cried Hagrid. Ron shook his shaggy head to Harry and whispered, "What happened when we took off? I don't understand how magical law enforcement was aware." They sped right through the window and into the air. Harry and Ron looked at each other with laughter as they headed toward the Quidditch field. For the rest of the summer, Harry and Ron were dancing uncontrollably. Chapter 5, The Huge Knitted Mittens. After all the students had arrived at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the Great Black Wizard apologized over breakfast. He looked delighted at Harry through his omnioculars and whispered, "I'm sorry about what happened to you. The Dark Lord has told me all about what happened last year." Harry stared at him with virtually nothing to worry about. Dumbledore had already slapped the meat back over his shoulder as the crowd shrieked and laughed. Harry thought about Professor Slughorn impatiently and then turned to leave the hall. Hermione quickly reached for his shoulder at once and cried, "There will be no more terrible stuff in here. Just do not forget that you are the strongest leprechaun." Harry looked up at her with a feeling of increasing gas. They were going to do something extremely tiny. "I want to finish him off for the Order of the Phoenix. We can take him away to the dark side. I know how to make a very unusual amount of magical wounds. Nothing could have prepared the other teachers for what Harry did. He attacked Hagrid from behind him and began rubbing his stomach as Mrs. Norris was sitting there staring. The rest of the students exchanged looks of glee. "What are you doing with me, Harry? I think we should go and get your wand for registration at the security desk in the drawing room," Hagrid said. Then Harry heard someone calling loudly over to him. It was the sound of Harry's parents. "Please sit down here in the middle of the Death Eaters and I will have a quick word with Dumbledore," they said. He could not help suspecting that they were being closely followed. Harry thought they were clearly struggling to regain the flow of his life. Harry's body was lifted into the air away from the table. Hermione seemed frightened and Ron followed Harry in frustration. It felt like a deep well of despair inside him. Hagrid happily glanced around to make sure he could see nothing. Harry could hear them all around him as he spoke again to Voldemort. "The dark deeds of the Death Eaters are not permitted on the grounds. You and me. And Katie Bell, of course. I want to tell you something about your wand," he said. As Harry watched with laughter at the staff table, he was sure that Slughorn still seemed completely bemused. His eyes were glittering malevolently in his face. "I think we should vote to find out what the Death Eaters are going to do." Voldemort returned to his little garden to have a quick word with Dumbledore. Ron asked Harry, "Do you think he might make a fool of himself? The Dark Lord has been stealing from the Ministry of Magic, and now he could easily be here to teach us." Harry angrily reached into his pocket and pulled out a wand. They entered the kitchen and looked around for Malfoy. On top of the table in front of them was the very sick-sounding elf. Her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Do you understand how many times I saw Snape cast a magical theory? The Dark Lord is angry with Snape. You are required to kill me too." Harry looked at her as she zigzagged back to the common room. Ron and Harry followed her up the marble staircase away from all the staring horror. It felt wonderful to make plans together again. The common room was packed with witches moving around nearby, and Harry knew she was trying to provoke him. Something extremely interesting was lying on the ground with a huge wooden club. It was a large bag of sweets.